So I'm going to call on the Cabinet Secretary. Before I do, I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question of Ms Forbes after her statement to press their request to speak buttons. And I call on Kate Forbes to deliver a statement on finance COVID-19. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The COVID-19 outbreak has required an unprecedented response from government, primarily focused on the health of our citizens, but also on the needs of our economy in response to the significant steps we've taken to keep people safe. And that has meant that significant additional resource has been deployed or redeployed from the budget this Parliament passed in March. Our action to date has been swift and targeted. We committed early to pass on all health and social care consequentials, currently estimated at £620 million, including hospices, to support our frontline services. We launched a £350 million package to support welfare and wellbeing. Partly from that, we've provided an extra £175 million for local government and underwritten integration authorities' costs to reduce delayed discharge. Within days of the outbreak, we committed £320 million to a package of small business grants and sector-targeted rates reliefs, and then moved to expand that into a £2.3 billion business support package that has removed this year's business rates liability for retail, leisure, hospitality and aviation, and for all other businesses effectively removed the inflationary increase in the poundage. It has offered £1.3 billion in grants for small businesses and for retail, leisure and hospitality. And now we have added a £100 million fund to support the newly self-employed and SMEs, addressing gaps in UK government provision. Now, the scale of the challenge required us to move quickly, and I feel it's important, therefore, to have the opportunity to update Parliament on the budget implications of the outbreak and of the actions the Scottish Government is taking to protect the interests of Scotland's people, communities and businesses. I'll provide regular updates on our financial approach to Parliament and the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and I'll provide detail later this month for Parliament's approval of an early summer budget revision. Our health and care services are at the front line of the efforts to tackle COVID-19, and we're working closely with the UK Government to ensure that all additional costs are fully funded. We're providing additional funding for NHS boards and integration authorities, and we're responding to the very urgent need to continue to ensure that frontline workers have the appropriate PPE. Along with my colleagues in Wales and Northern Ireland, we're seeking clarification from the Treasury that our committed PPE spend to date will be covered by Barnett consequentials in relation to spend by NHS England and for the social care sector. As the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport indicated last week, we've provided a direct delivery of PPE to care homes and have worked with local partners to significantly improve the operation of local PPE hubs. On the economy, I'm proud that we are delivering a strong package of support worth around £2.3 billion for businesses in Scotland. We've provided £50 million to effectively freeze the non-domestic rates poundage at last year's level, the only country in the UK to do so. We've committed £824 million to provide 100% rates relief to properties in the retail, hospitality, leisure and aviation sectors, the only part of the UK to support the aviation sector in this way. And we've made £1.3 billion of support available through two grant schemes for small businesses and for retail, hospitality and leisure. We estimate that around 3,500 properties in the broader economy will benefit from a £7,500 grant in Scotland, but whose equivalents would receive nothing in England. So I'm delighted that on the 30th of April, the Scottish Government opened applications for a £100 million package of additional grant support for SME businesses and newly self-employed people. And today marks the opening of the second phase of our original business grants funding scheme, relaxing the restriction on multiple properties. Unfortunately, we do not have the resource to protect every single business from the economic damage of COVID-19. Yet by last Tuesday, a week ago, over £526 million of grants had been paid out to businesses, and I'd like to thank local authorities for mobilising their resources so quickly to get those grants out. The £350 million package of communities funding announced by the Scottish Government on the 18th of March in advance of the UK Government's announcement of support for local government, ensures that local authorities, community groups and the third sector are able to support people and communities affected by COVID-19. Since its launch, we've already committed over £182 million from the package across various funding streams. Over £100 million has been allocated to local authorities through the £50 million Hardship Fund, an increase of £22 million to the Scottish Welfare Fund and a £30 million food fund. Over 160,000 free school meals are being distributed each day by local authorities, supported by that investment. And we've committed considerable other investment to charities and community organisations. We have to date provided significant additional resources and flexibilities to local government, including committing £175.6 million of direct funding and further flexibility, including de-ring-fencing grants. And we'll also provide additional support for health and social care through the integrated joint boards. The Scottish Government had already committed £175.6 million to local government before we had indication that the UK Government would provide us with additional consequentials for local government. And in the last week or so, we've received indication of £155 million of consequentials from local government spending in England. That money will be available to local government in full, but in order to make decisions on how it should be distributed amongst councils to top up that original £175.6 million, I need details from COSLA on the funding pressures being faced by their members so that it can be spent fairly on the areas of greatest need. This continues to be an incredibly difficult time for people across the country, and my sympathy is with every family affected and those touched by every life lost. And that's why ensuring that Scotland has the support it requires to deal with COVID-19 and recover from its effects continues to be the top priority for this government. Our actions have been welcomed by the private and third sectors alike, and I believe they are making a real difference to people's lives in Scotland. I'd like us to do more, but ultimately we are constrained financially and through limited devolved powers. We currently anticipate an estimated £3.5 billion in Barnett consequentials this year to support the COVID-19 response, and that funding is welcome. And I want to put on record the constructive conversations I have had with my counterparts in Treasury. We remain committed to ensuring that every penny at our disposal will be spent on safeguarding Scotland's interests, but it does not cover the need. I'll continue to engage with Treasury to ensure that Scotland's NHS and businesses get the funding they need. But without appropriate borrowing powers, this is of course the only source of additional funding available, and I don't think anybody can argue that it reflects the full magnitude of what we have needed and will continue to need to face this unprecedented situation. Other governments are of course free to borrow to fund their COVID-19 response. We have no powers to do that, given the unnecessary restrictions on our borrowing powers imposed by the fiscal framework. In fact, it's one of the remarkable aspects of the fiscal framework that the Scottish Government cannot borrow in the same way as Scottish local government. The longer-term health and economic impacts of COVID-19 in different parts of the UK remain uncertain. It's important that Scotland's public finances do not face undue risks on the basis of circumstances out with our control, and will continue to engage with the UK Government, as we've been doing, to make sure that that does not happen. The UK Government, I believe, must surely recognise the fundamental flaws inherent in the framework and permit further flexibility to allow us to respond to this crisis. I've asked the UK Government to guarantee, for example, that Barnett consequentials notified thus far are not subsequently reduced, thereby clawing back money from the Scottish budget at a later date. So, Presiding Officer, the inherent uncertainties of the fiscal framework are well documented and have been subject to much debate here. If it was true before the health and economic crises, then it's even more accurate just now. Putting party differences to one side, I hope there will be unity in this chamber on the importance of managing our budget position with additional fiscal flexibilities through borrowing, guaranteed consequentials and managing future reconciliations. Fairness and transparency are essential here and also sit at the core of the Scottish Government's tax policy. We recognise the challenges presented by tax avoidance behaviours and remain vigilant, particularly around the financial assistance schemes that have been announced by both the Scottish and the UK governments. Yet to even start to think radically on big responses to big issues and ideas such as universal basic income, we need enhanced taxation and our other powers, and we'll continue to make that case. Now, we have published our overarching framework for decision-making, which describes the approach the Scottish Government will take over the initial transition out of current lockdown arrangements. That's something that we will be keeping under review. And even though it's hard to be precise about future impacts, there will be a legacy from COVID-19 that will last some considerable time. There will be a continuing public health response and changes within society in the way that people and businesses interact with each other and to models of service delivery as we look to restart and recover the economy. As the framework notes, before this crisis, we were focused on making Scotland a greener, fairer and more prosperous country. And while this has not changed, the place from where we are starting has. And we'll work with and learn across this chamber from Scotland's private, third and public sectors and from governments around the world. I want to continue to invest to support Scotland and for the avoidance of doubt that recovery will not and should be not a time for austerity. It's essential that we take the opportunities of recovery and think radically, embracing digital technologies and low-carbon reforms. And to do that, we need to think long-term, we need to work across party lines, and we need the powers to invest in our future. Presiding Officer, in the last few weeks, we've seen businesses across Scotland repurpose to deliver new products and services, and I'm proud that many have pivoted their operations to deliver support for the NHS supply chain, saving jobs and saving lives. Through necessity, we have seen sectors embrace new technologies and innovation at a rate and a scale that would ordinarily have taken years. The Scottish Government must play its role in maintaining that speed and momentum, moving with pace towards a new high-tech, low-carbon economy. To realise that vision, we need to catalyse our most innovative, emerging sectors, ensuring they fulfil their full potential, both as economic propositions in their own right and as sources of innovation for our wider economy. And that's why I'm pleased to announce that from next week, Mark Logan, a well-known name, will lead a short life review of the Scottish tech ecosystem. He brings a wealth of experience accumulated through 25 successful years in building Scottish tech startups, culminating in the success of Skyscanner, one of the most significant European tech unicorns. I've been clear with Mr. Logan that we're looking for clear, ambitious, deliverable proposals that allow us to seize the opportunities that economic recovery will present. He's passionate about creating an ecosystem that provides opportunities for a new generation of tech talent, and I look forward to receiving his recommendations. Presiding Officer, as I close, the fiscal challenges from COVID-19 are significant beyond doubt, but our priority must continue to be protecting lives and supporting the economy through this turbulent period. In Scotland, our recovery and future renewal will be guided by our long-term vision of investing in an inclusive, sustainable, well-being economy. How we design and deliver our recovery can help us make progress towards that vision. We will recover, and the Scottish Government is determined that Scotland will emerge stronger with a fairer and more sustainable economy with opportunities for all.
Thank you very much. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions. Donald Cameron to be followed by Richard Leonard. Donald Cameron.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of her statement, and I was pleased to see her welcome the £3.5 billion anticipated from UK Government for spending in Scotland, and hear her acknowledge the constructive conversations she's had with Treasury. Her statement concentrates more on a broad, longer-term budgetary outlook, which we will take time to digest and respond to in due course. However, it's concerns around the economic interventions by her government that remain the priority for many of the people we represent, given the immediate impact on their livelihoods, whether that's delays in getting business support to those at the front line or the continuing disparity in treatment between businesses in Scotland compared to their counterparts in the rest of the UK. And while we continue to welcome many aspects of the Scottish Government's funding package, there remains widespread dismay and indeed shock that the Scottish Government will not deliver at once the £155 million direct to local authorities coming to Scotland through consequentials. This is not merely a storm in a teacup. Our local authorities are at the forefront of delivering vital services to the most vulnerable, but have yet to receive any details of what this funding can be used for and how much they will receive. They've also been told that they should use reserves to meet current costs. That is unconscionable and unacceptable. Can I ask her, when will every penny of the £155 million go to local authorities, and will the Scottish Government give local authorities full discretion over what this money can be used for?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, I have just agreed that every penny of that £155 million will go to local government. We recognise the cost pressures they are facing. We recognise the enormous amount of work that local authorities have done, many of them on the front line in our response to COVID-19. We have already, in light of the pressures on local authority, given £175 million to local authorities. But the member will appreciate, and I say this having already stated the constructive working relationship I have with Treasury, that the Scottish Government in many respects has moved faster, providing funding before we had any indication that consequentials would be available. We have done that on business, we have done that on local authorities, we have done that on charities. That consequentials then came after, once we had made the announcement. But I hope he will appreciate the points I've made about funding local authorities. He talks too about the disparity between the Scottish Government and the wider UK Government in its response to business. We do that in light of the different needs of the Scottish economy and the small businesses that are benefiting from that support in Scotland who wouldn't be elsewhere in England, the aviation sector, the fishing sector, the creative sector, all those sectors are benefiting here that aren't benefiting elsewhere. So it's important that with the powers and the resources we have, we ensure that our response to coronavirus is robust, it tackles the issues where they need to be tackled, and the nature of devolution is that we are able to take different decisions for different outcomes in order to protect the people and the economy and the communities of Scotland.
Richard Leonard, to be followed by Andy Whiteman. Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for an advance copy of her statement. In it, in the section on support for the economy, there is reference to support for businesses, which is welcome, but the statement makes no mention anywhere, at any point, of unemployment, even though we know that this is a very real and present danger to working people in communities right across Scotland, and even though there is a particular dimension to this. The Institute for Fiscal Studies estimated last month that workers under the age of 25 are 2.5 times more likely to have been laid off than older workers because of the concentration of young people in shut-down sectors like hospitality, hotels and non-food retail. And we know that long-term unemployment among young people is especially damaging. So, will the Scottish Government produce a new plan for jobs? Will the Cabinet Secretary consider, as part of that, the funding for the introduction of a quality, trades union-backed jobs guarantee scheme to tackle unemployment? And will she target the under-25s as part of that scheme?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for his question. And to be clear, when it comes to the economic measures that we've put in place, my two priorities have always been to first ensure that it's workers, that it's employees that have money in their pockets, and that secondly, we try and protect some of the productive capacity with the economy in terms of a structural basis. So the points he makes are well made. Our economic analysis just demonstrates that there are certain demographics that are being far harder hit than others. I think there's an age element to that. There's also a gender element to that as well. The Scottish Government has twice weekly ministerial discussions with the STUC and General Council members during the current crisis. We've already agreed with STUC, for example, a joint statement on fair working principles during the crisis. And we will consider the points that he makes and some of the other points that have been made by the STUC and GMB in their campaigns most recently as part of our ongoing consideration of how to ensure that coming out of this crisis, we have a fairer, more equal society than when we entered it.
Andy Whiteman to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of the statement. She states that fairness and transparency are essential and that vigilance is vital in relationship to tax avoidance. So 2 questions. First, will the Minister publish on a regular basis details of which businesses and ratepayers received what grants in relation to which properties occupied? And secondly, how will vigilance in relation to tax avoidance be carried out? Is there scope, for example, to claw back any grant awarded to companies engaged in tax avoidance?
Cabinet Secretary.
So both of those points have been areas that of discussion already and consideration. The member will know that in relation to tax avoidance, we have got far more restricted powers in terms of cracking down on that. In terms of the publication of grants, it's an area that I was quite keen to see movement on. There are issues with GDPR and such like. But in terms of those 2 points, if there is additional information that I can publish, then I would like to publish. As he will know, we've already made steps to publish the grant distribution, for example, on a local authority basis. If we can publish more granular data, then I'd be keen to do so.
Willie Rennie to be followed by Bruce Crawford.
The Finance Secretary must know that councils are frustrated by the strings that are being attached to the money that they need to deal with this crisis. They're doing the right thing in the middle of this crisis, and I hope the Finance Secretary will do that as well. There are many businesses that have a higher rateable value that are struggling without the grant support, and as this lockdown continues, will she consider proposals to support them, because I fear for their future? And what discussions has she had with the Treasury on a universal basic income?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank the member for those points. And in terms of local government is doing the right thing. Again, I've been blown away by the way in which employees across local government have stepped up to the plate, most of them working from home, most of them working incredibly long hours in order to, for example, get grant support out. And I do want to ensure that they have the resources that they need and will work constructively with COSLA to do that. In terms of businesses that I'm assuming he's meaning above the £51,000 threshold in rateable value, I recognise that that's a gap. That's why one of the main reasons that we put in place the £100 million fund, and in particular the Pivotal Enterprises Resilience Fund, was designed to try and support those businesses that are too big for grant funding, but are key to local economies. They often support a much wider supply chain and keep many jobs going. So that fund was designed to help that. The member will appreciate that we have to deliver a fixed, balanced budget. There are no quick and easy ways of creating additional headroom to extend our business support, for example. The only way of doing that just now is through additional consequentials. And I have regular discussions with counterparts in Treasury in order to secure further funding to deliver a more generous business support scheme than we have done, and in particular when it comes through recovery. And he asked a third question that I didn't note down. So I
universal basic income.
Oh, and universal basic income. Yes, again, it's when it came to just briefly, when it came to mobilising the systems we have, whether it was through local authorities or enterprise agencies, the thing that constantly struck me was that the fastest way of getting support directly into people's pockets was through HMRC. There was no other scheme, and of course the management of HMRC is reserved. And so I do believe that we need to consider universal basic income, not just through crises like this, but also beyond, and is a subject of discussion. In a sense, it's part of that wider package of discussion in terms of additional powers. These are not points that are being made for constitutional or political reasons. These are points that are being made to ensure that we can respond to crises like this and support people and businesses in our communities.
Bruce Crawford, followed by Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will agree with me that a healthy and dynamic university sector is crucial to the future of the Scottish economy. Like many sectors, universities face an existential challenge and financial threat because of COVID-19. Stirling University, for example, I know has deep and mounting deficit of many millions of pounds. The university is clear that without additional financial support from government, they face significant redundancies and course closures. Would the Cabinet Secretary therefore undertake to discuss this situation with the UK Government as a matter of urgency?
Cabinet Secretary.
I can assure the member that these matters are already being discussed as a matter of emergency and urgency. I know that the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, has had regular discussions with his counterpart in the Department for Education because they are facing similar issues, and both have made joint representations to the Treasury looking for funding. The announcement that was made over the weekend does not in any way go far enough, in our understanding, to supporting the FE and HE sector. And I know that the Deputy First Minister is looking actively at the moment about how we do that.
Maurice Golden, to be followed by Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister has promised help for the oil and gas industry, but last week she said she hasn't yet decided what that support would be. Oil and gas workers are losing their jobs. They can't afford to wait any longer. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm when a decision will be reached and what support the Scottish Government will provide?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I understand that concern, and without wanting to be political in any way, the member will also know that most of the powers in order to intervene with the oil and gas industry are reserved. One of the most obvious areas is ensuring that there is furlough support, for example, to the oil and gas industry. But we are actively looking at what offer we can provide. Paul Wheelhouse, my colleague, has regular meetings with the industry, and he's working closely with them to understand what more that the Scottish Government, with our powers and our resources, can do. But any intervention, I believe, needs to be jointly done because most of those powers still rest with the UK Government.
Gillian Martin, to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Without wishing to labour the point any further, but it is an important issue that's just been brought up. Before this crisis, oil and gas workers were going to be at the heart of a just transition away from fossil fuels to low-emission energy, and that just transition seems more pressing than ever as oil and gas companies are making many workers redundant at this time, a combination of the pandemic and the low oil price. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what's been done to assist those former employees and contractors that are not only they're being refused furlough at the moment, a lot of them, and of course they don't have an opportunity to find out other work because of the pandemic situation? And has she had any discussions with the UK Government on what they could be doing to assist the people who work in this sector, which is still so important because we haven't had that just transition yet, and it's affecting many families in my constituency?
Kate Forbes.
Yes, we have had those discussions in terms of those employees. There is support on hand, whether that's through welfare support or in particular ensuring that when we come to recovery, there is support in place to help them through this period of redundancy and into work. But those conversations, as I said in my earlier answer, have got to be done in collaboration with the UK Government. A lot of the most significant levers to intervene in the oil and gas industry, which is going through an incredibly difficult time, rest with the UK Government. In terms of funding support and anything else that we can do, we are in constant dialogue with the industry to understand the action that we can take, and we will take that action in order to protect jobs.
Jackie Bailey, to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Can I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's statement, and particularly because her previous position of not telling Parliament the detail of budget allocations until summer revisions was neither transparent nor sustainable. Can I say to her, though, the Scottish Government were not asked to submit plans to the UK Government before money was released. Indeed, business costs Food bank costs, health board costs have not been asked to submit plans to the government before money has been released. The second tranche of £155 million is for social care, for homelessness, critically urgent areas, and councils in England already have this money to spend. So why is she asking for plans to be submitted in advance now? And does this point to a lack of trust in local government? Let me ask her, if she truly believes that this is a storm in a teacup, why then did SNP councillors on COSLA vote against her to demand the release of the money now?
Cabinet Secretary.
Local authorities in Scotland already have £175 million to support. Yes, they do. They already have £175 million in order to support the coronavirus effort. That money was available to them before local authorities in England got funding. And the absurd nature of this whole debate is that we have said, the First Minister said 2 weeks ago that she would pass on the consequentials for local government to local government in Scotland. Local government, since the beginning of April, has been working on a cost collection exercise to identify the biggest pressures on them right now. I want to make sure that that money is spent on the areas of greatest need. And I do not think it's unreasonable to ask for local authorities to complete the cost collection exercise they promised me 2 weeks ago in order to determine how that money can best be spent. But when all's said and done, local authorities are getting £155 million on top of a previous allocation of £175 million because of the tremendous work they are doing.
Willie Coffey to be followed by Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary on behalf of a number of small businesses in my constituency, for example, opticians, barbers, hairdressers and other shops, many of whom are struggling financially despite the welcome help they're receiving so far, could she assure them that the Government is looking at what safety arrangements might be for different businesses and when we might be able to share that kind of thinking with them so that they can begin to prepare their businesses to reopen when it's safe for them to do so? And will those small businesses still be eligible for some financial support as they slowly get their operations back up and running?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm working closely with Fiona Hislop and other Cabinet Secretaries to develop an approach that unlocks the economy unlocks it safely, building on the framework for decision-making that was published recently, about 2 weeks ago. And that will set out the range of factors and judgments that governments need to consider in order to allow the economy to safely transition beyond lockdown. We're working closely with business groups and with trade unions and others as part of that process. And we need a transition that reflects the public health advice, but also offers businesses a clear way forward in both the short term and as part of a longer term recovery process. We'll set out further advice in due course on that, and we'll also continue to engage with the UK Government and the other devolved administrations to shape that UK-wide response.
Thank you. Michelle Ballantyne to be followed by Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I just make one point as well? COSLA's cost collection exercise is part of the Council's own due diligence process. It was not a request by the Cabinet Secretary. But I want to talk about business and follow on actually from Willie Coffey's question that he's just asked. The one area that is not political and that doesn't make statements for political purposes is business. They are about survival now and about protecting the jobs of the people that they employ. The Scottish Government has completely consistently talked about the emphasis on geographical variation, and it's talked about it again in its framework for decision making. Many businesses, in fact all those businesses that export across Scotland, do so with supply chains and customers across the UK. The UK Government has already started to bring out its guidance for returning to work, and businesses south of the border are starting to do that. If Scottish businesses cannot start to open alongside that, they will start to lose competitive advantage. The very thing that Fiona Hislop said at my committee would not happen. Can I ask that the Cabinet Secretary takes this seriously? That her framework for decision-making suggests that there will be no further guidance until the 28th of May. That is too late for many businesses.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the member will know that we have tried very carefully to have an open and an honest conversation about what transition out of lockdown will look like. What we do take very seriously is people's health, protecting lives, ensuring that we only move beyond the current period when it is safe to do so. And I speak, and not wanting to talk about my constituency in any way, but just this last week, in terms of the outbreak on Skye, some of the businesses there had been starting to reopen. They're closed again because of the outbreak in Skye. And we need to take those decisions very carefully. They need to be informed by the best available medical and scientific advice that we have. And there is a burden on all of our shoulders to ensure that the decisions we make minimise harm to, yes, to the economy, but ultimately to people.
Tom Arthur, to be followed by Colin Smith. Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There are some sectors, such as grassroots music venues and travel agencies, where it is difficult to envisage them being able to return to their pre-corona capacity for some considerable time, perhaps not even until there is a vaccine. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary for what consideration has been given by the Government to supporting these businesses in repurposing and for what could be quite an extended period of recovery for them?
Cabinet Secretary.
So that will most certainly have to be part of our recovery. In terms of our initial response when it came to business support, the two things that we tried to do was to minimise people's fixed costs, so in many cases removing their non-domestic rates, for example, not just for a few months but for a full year, and then to provide some grant support as well. So that support will still be available, but I think the point that Tom Arthur makes around helping people to transition, to repurpose their businesses, as we've already seen during the crisis, will need to form part of our recovery.
Thank you. Colin Smith, to be followed by Angela Constance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Everyone understands that support provided to businesses is changing all the time, and more support will be provided. So will the Cabinet Secretary consider fully addressing the unfairness that while a hospitality business in Cumbria with a rateable value of just over £15,000 is entitled to a £25,000 grant, but a similar business just over the border in the south of Scotland with the same rateable value is entitled to a grant of just £10,000? And can she tell me why one of the requirements for applicants for the new Hospitality Hardship Fund is to have a business bank account, which isn't a legal requirement for sole traders and partnerships? Because there is concern among, for example, guest houses who pay council tax and not rates, that they could be denied the only support they thought they may be entitled to because they have a separate but personal bank account to carry out the guest house transactions. Will they be entitled to a grant from the Hardship Fund, or will they be ruled out? And what is an unfair technicality?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the member will know that eligibility for the grant scheme is based on the non-domestic rate system and on the small business scheme, which is the one in Scotland is the most generous in the UK, and the support in terms of grant reflects those thresholds in the small business bonus scheme. Now that of course means that hundreds more businesses in Scotland in the wider economy that are eligible for the small business bonus scheme are getting grants in Scotland that wouldn't get them elsewhere in the UK. So if they have a rateable value of £17,000 and they're not in retail, leisure or hospitality in Scotland, they will get a grant. In the rest of the UK, they wouldn't get a grant. And so at the end of the day, when we draw thresholds, my job is to make sure that the money goes as far as possible, helps as many businesses as possible, reflects the challenges within the Scottish economy. And that's what we've done with the grant scheme. In terms of the requirement to have a business bank account, I understand that's been an issue that's been raised. It's been raised in my own constituency as well, where small businesses don't have business bank accounts. One of the difficulties with this scheme that's not linked to a tax system, for example, is to ensure that we reduce fraud levels. With limited resources, I want that money to go as far as possible and to help as many businesses as possible. We therefore have to have consideration of due diligence and to minimise the fraud risk. And a business bank account was considered to be a far simpler means of doing that than putting in place more bureaucratic systems. However, if I can review that and change that, I would like to, but I do need to make sure that where there have been other schemes like this that have seen high levels of fraud, that is not reflected in these schemes, because we need to make sure that every single penny helps as many businesses as possible.
Angela Constance, to be followed by Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Travel Yard in West Calder is a small bespoke travel service in my constituency. As an organisation, they have worked tirelessly to bring stranded travellers home. They are meeting their obligations to customers, incurring costs to do so as an agent with cancellation, 100% refunds to customers and rescheduling. They are doing all of this despite the evaporation of volume of business and profits. And on top of that, they're being driven demented in pursuing business interruption insurance claims. Therefore, what can the Scottish Government do, and how will it persuade the UK Government to ensure a more bespoke support for the unique travel sector? For example, with commission protection schemes and better support in relation to making insurance claims, given that a high proportion of companies in the tourism sector have inadequate or irrelevant insurance.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank the member. I think it's accurate. It's well documented that the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme has not been able to help as many small businesses by any stretch of the imagination. If you look at the average loan amount, it's quite clear that it's disproportionately going to much bigger businesses and leaving small and medium-sized businesses without that support. I think that's why the Treasury introduced the bounce back loan scheme, and so that is one option. Again, I know it's difficult because this is not a time when businesses want to accrue more debt, least of all our small and medium-sized businesses. But in terms of we raise these issues on a regular basis with the UK Government to ensure that there is more support for particular sectors. And when it comes to the unique travel sector, I imagine some of them will be able to benefit from the new £100 million loan fund, which is specifically targeted in terms of the smaller fund to the travel, hospitality and tourism sector. So that might be a means of filling the gap that she has identified.
Edward Mountain to be followed by Annabel Ewing. Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, as you know, the Highland economy is highly reliant on tourism, and especially our small bed and breakfast. Scottish Government set up the Tourism and Hospitality Hardship Fund worth £20 million, which is open to all tourism and hospitality businesses. As you've made clear, many small B&Bs will be ineligible to claim due to the fact they don't meet the criteria in that they don't have separate business bank accounts, despite having all the necessary regulatory consents. So how many B&Bs, small B&Bs, does she estimate this £20 million fund will actually help?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, obviously that depends on the grants that are being provided, and we've designed these schemes specifically to be as bespoke as possible. So the fund he mentioned, we talk about £3,000 grants, but you can get grants up to £25,000. So of course, the number of businesses will determine the amount that they get will determine the number of businesses that receive it. At the moment, there is that scheme is not oversubscribed, so I would encourage B&Bs to apply for it. I know the point around business banking. I think I've already addressed it, and it's that tension that we live with, that when we're distributing public funds, we have a responsibility to ensure that we take appropriate steps to minimise the risk of fraudulent claims. But if the member has an additional point that he wants to raise with me after this, I'd be very happy to address it.
Annabel Ewing to be followed by Lewis MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, on the key issue of economic recovery, for any alterations to lockdown restrictions to work, it is, of course, vital that social distancing in the workplace be secured. So instead of this being left, it would appear at the moment, in many cases, to individual employees to raise concerns with their MSPs when they're being told that they're expected back at the workplace, but they're concerned about the conditions that will therefore pertain, would it not be a reasonable approach to put the onus on the employer to demonstrate that social distancing can indeed be achieved?
Cabinet Secretary.
The member makes a good point. We'll keep our guidelines constantly under review, and we'll only take decisions when the scientific advice is clear that they are safe to do so. And until that point, there is absolutely an onus on businesses, and we expect all businesses to adhere to the current guidance, which is designed to keep people safe, and that includes social distancing. This is, whilst I know people have been living with now about almost 7 weeks of lockdown, it is critical that people continue to follow that government guidance. And there is an expectation on employers that they will protect their employees and ensure that the working environment is a safe place to work.
Lewis MacDonald to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you very much. The Cabinet Secretary said on the 17th of April about the oil and gas industry, our strong steer is that we expect employees to be furloughed, not made redundant. That is why the support exists. With so many workers now facing redundancy, what would she say to those employers who have taken the view that the job retention scheme does not apply to them?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think it's a very disappointing position for those employers to take. That scheme is available. We have worked with the oil and gas industry to ensure that there is support in place, and I think it's extremely disappointing at a time of national emergency when people are struggling that those employees have been made redundant when there is support in place. I don't dispute the challenges facing the oil and gas industry or the wider economy, but at a time like this, when we're theoretically all in it together, there is a responsibility on employers to treat their employees with respect, to protect them and to help them through these difficult weeks. There is funding, there is unusual, extraordinary funding, government funding in place to help employers do so, and I would expect employers to make use of that to ensure that their employees continue to be paid.
Thank you. Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, many businesses struggle to survive. Supermarkets are making huge profits, and not just through increased sales. Across the UK, Tesco will receive £585 million in rates relief while paying out £635 million in dividends just last month. Meanwhile, prices have gone up, discounts and special offers are increasingly rare, pushing up costs for customers. The Cabinet Secretary recently, just a few minutes ago, criticised the UK loan interruption scheme because a lot of the money for these loans is going to big businesses. So is it not time to reconsider some of the rates relief for supermarkets, with that relief being switched to support smaller businesses?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, whilst we keep many things under review, and I know Fergus Ewing is in regular dialogue with the supermarkets, it's precisely that reason why we ensured that our business support focused on the small and medium-sized businesses in Scotland, which are the backbone of the Scottish economy, and they are the backbone of multiple local economies. And our criteria ensures that more small businesses will get a grant in Scotland than elsewhere, precisely because of the way that we've tailored that support. So I recognise that there will be much debate about the rights and wrongs of how we support businesses, but at the end of the day, with the limited resources we have ensured that we protect the small and medium-sized businesses rather than prioritising the big businesses.
Brian Whittle to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I spent yesterday speaking to a number of businesses in my regions to see how they were coping with the current crisis. And as you might imagine, a lot of businesses, they're not sitting idle. They're looking at ways to adapt their working protocols to enable them to stick to government guidelines, looking at how they can, when the time is right, how they can come back to work, ensuring health and safety of their employees. What's been talked about a lot is a sector return when the time is right. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what considerations may be given to looking at how we can enable businesses who are looking at and are able to stick to government guidelines, how we can help them to get back to work, and that might allow more finance to support those businesses who currently can't get back to work?
Cabinet Secretary.
So this is very much part of our thinking just now, that when it comes to transitioning out, it's clear that it will be those businesses that can adhere to social distancing that will be able to go back to work first. And this virus is going to be with us not just for a matter of weeks, months, and maybe longer. So we've got to ensure that our businesses can adapt to meet the government guidelines and protect and keep people safe. So when it comes to our thinking around transitioning out of this, it will be on the basis of which businesses can adapt to social distancing. In some cases, they will need to make structural changes to their business. They will need to make changes to the way that they operate, the things that they do. Many businesses have already had to do that through this period. That will continue. And that's precisely the thought that we are giving to transition. There will, of course, we've already published documentation. Again, the First Minister published more on this yesterday with the test, trace, isolate. But we will continue to review these guidelines and publish, when it is appropriate to do so, further guidelines to give advice to businesses.
And Neil Findlay to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what very specific advice she gives to workers who have been told that they are furloughed, they are working from home full-time, but only receive 80% of their wage, and who feel they cannot raise issues with their employer for fear of repercussions?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the advice I would give to them is that that's completely unacceptable. That should not be happening. Where it is happening, and the member feels able to raise it with me or others in terms of specific businesses, then those businesses should not be doing that. There's an expectation when it comes to the furlough scheme that if somebody is working full-time, then they should be paid as a full-time worker. When they are furloughed, then obviously that is 80%, but there's very clear guidelines and strict criteria around what they can and cannot do as a furloughed employee. In terms of advice I would give, of course, as we've discussed earlier, we raise and discuss these matters on a twice-weekly basis with the unions, and I would encourage them to raise it either with a union or somebody else that will listen.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The 100% rate relief was extended beyond the hospitality sector to include airports and other ancillary named businesses. One kind of business that doesn't include are airport car parks. So there are many of these in my constituency, and they are big employers, and they suffer an existential threat without being included in the ancillary businesses around airports. What consideration will the Cabinet Secretary and her government give to including airport car parks in the rates relief scheme?
Cabinet Secretary.
Whilst I will give consideration to any sector or business that needs support, there are two items that are worth mentioning. The first is that when it comes to extending support, we have got a restricted budget. So when it comes to affordability, obviously a case has been made by a number of other sectors for that. And so I'm happy to review any proposal. But at the end of the day, the greatest challenge is around affordability. We have tried to do things differently. We have tried to approach this on a sectoral basis. That's why airports have support. But when it comes to extending that further, the challenge is affordability. There's another challenge, which is legislative in nature, about retrospective rates relief, but I won't go into that just now.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our Finance COVID-19 statement. Before we move on to the next item of business, just to encourage members or remind members to observe social distancing when leaving or entering the chamber. Thank you very much.